Welcome to the Gentleman's Guide to Gaming, and a request video. It's an advice column piece this time. You see, Matthew got in touch with me and made a request. That isn't me, by the way. I know my name is Matthew, but there are more than one of us in the world today. Matthew used to be a more common name, didn't it? It was more popular. But I think, like a lot of New Testament names, it's kind of tapered off in terms of popularity. Unlike Old Testament names, which seem to be receiving some kind of resurgence, you can't move for bumping into Noahs, Noels, Jacobs. There aren't so many Jezreels, or Lo Ruhamas, or Chushan Rishathaims, but who knows? I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure there are some of the more obscure Old Testament names going right now, but anyway, Matthew wasn't asking me about how to name characters in RPGs. That's a different video. Matthew had a request because, you see, Matthew picked up a hard copy of The World Below, and as you no doubt know by this point, if you buy yourself a hard copy of The World Below, if you go on BackerKit and order one through there, or go on DriveThruRPG and pick up a hard copy, then contact me through MatthewDawkins.com. You can request any video of your choice. And Matthew's request was as follows. I would like to see a video on how to maximize one's time in planning to run horror RPGs. I guess we can narrow that down to games in the World of Darkness or Chronicles of Darkness mold, says Matthew. It's a very good question because you can waste an awful lot of time when planning RPGs, focusing on the wrong things. And the idea of maximizing one's time sounds very much like some kind of agile working practice or something like that. And I'm not cynical, but I'm also self-employed and something of a self-starter, I guess you might say. So I don't have much in the way of workflows and having to maximize my time in that regard. But that doesn't mean I don't have to do it. And when thinking about planning an RPG, let's look first of all on where you can go wrong. When planning a horror RPG, you could focus too much on the plot and forget entirely about the characters. Anecdotally, for example, I'm sure every one of you has participated in a game like this. I have played in an RPG where each player was given a 30-page dossier on the world we were playing in, the NPCs, the political setup, and so forth, but there was absolutely zero focus on the characters we were playing or what our role within it would be. So come the first session, our characters were basically plonked into this world, and those of us who had read the dossier felt, okay, well, we know what the world is and what we could interact with, but the GM, storyteller in this case, because this was a game of vampire, hadn't accounted really for how the players might interact with the delicately crafted pieces of the world he had envisioned. So when we started poking at the fabric and, pulling away at the seams, at the threads, he started getting very agitated. This isn't the game he envisioned. You can really waste your time planning a horror RPG if you have too many ideas in mind rather than going with the flow, improvising, reacting based on player decisions. But we'll get on to that. So that isn't to say don't have an idea in mind. It isn't to say don't plan things out, because some people really enjoy the planning. Some people get more out of the planning than they do the running, though I would argue maybe storytelling shouldn't be their main focus. If they just want to write, they should write. That's why people write novels and fan fiction and all the rest. It's a perfectly valid way of expressing yourself, but maybe running games isn't for you. That may sound a bit gatekeepy, but I've had my terrible experiences, and as I say, I'm sure some of you have too. Another way, I guess, counter-wise or contrary-wise to what I just said, is over-focus on the characters and no focus on the plot. So if, for example, and this happens far less often, your storyteller gets all the details of the characters that we want played and then thinks, you know what, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time coming up with the story. Instead, I'm just going to bounce off of their ideas. Now, while I wouldn't call this a waste of time, because in short, the storyteller has spent no time at all, it will end up being quite a weak session unless you've got a really strong storyteller who can improvise a gripping story every single time. Now, I've met lots of storytellers. In fact, I consider myself a GM or story guide, a keeper, a storyteller who is pretty good at crafting stories based on players doing unexpected things. But there are plenty of others who just stare blankly when they're presented with something they don't know what to do, or they'll come up with something stupid, or they'll punish the players because the players have come up with something they haven't anticipated. And it isn't necessarily a sadistic form of punishment. They're not trying to say, how dare you? What they're trying to do is, in a sense, slap them down, or they overreact, they overcompensate by throwing a much more powerful enemy in the path of the characters just so they've got some breathing room. That kind of game can fall down. It's not so much about wasting time at the front end as it is about, in this case, I guess you would you would end up having wasted everyone's time after the fact. Now, there are other ways you can waste your time. For example, you could focus overmuch on the twists. You could focus too much on your NPCs, make them the stars of the show instead of the player characters. This is something I spend a lot of time on in other videos regarding Vampire, and like the Transylvania Chronicles, the Giovanni Chronicles. It's something I was speaking to some of my players about recently. Someone mentioned the linearity of those published adventures for Vampire the Masquerade, and how the players get very little agency, or the protagonists don't get the agency, the NPCs do. To which I'm pretty defensive when it comes to those published chronicles, because I don't think they're supposed to be run right from the page. In fact, I think it's impossible to run a published Vampire the Masquerade chronicle right off the page and for it to be good for the vast majority of players. The storyteller needs to adapt what's on the page to cater to the players who are currently your central characters. And if they can change it, remove this NPC, replace it with an NPC that character has introduced as their rival or their best friend, change the location slightly to make it more meaningful, that sort of thing, then at that point you are actually spending your time fruitfully, and everyone's going to have a good time because you've adjusted, you've tailored the campaign to suit your players. All that said, a way of wasting your time is focusing on the NPCs to make them more interesting than the player characters, or memorizing an entire published chronicle thinking, I've got to run it exactly like this. If you cement it in your brain that it's got to run exactly as the page has it, you may end up with paralysis when the players do something unexpected. This kind of happened to me with Masks of Nyarlathotep. I'm currently running that for Red Moon Roleplaying, and we, as of time of recording, the characters have reached Britain. I was actually anticipating them going elsewhere in the world. We discussed it out of character at a crucial point. We said, I would like to know, just so I can prepare, which country in this globe-trotting adventure you intend to visit next. They all said Britain, and I was quite surprised by that. And that meant, okay, well, I need to scrap all of my Egyptian stuff and focus on the British element instead. So getting too wedded to what's written is a problem. So now we've talked about the problems, let's talk about solutions. Good ways to maximize your time in planning for an RPG. Dialogue with the players is one. You want to speak to the players and you want to find out the kind of story they want to participate in. And remember, it's not the story you're telling, it is a collaborative effort. So it's the story they want to participate in and the characters they want to play. Even if the system doesn't allow for it, even if there isn't some aspiration system, some virtue and vice system or something like that, even if we are just talking bog standard first edition Vampire the Masquerade, I think it is always worth asking the players, can you tell me one thing your character wants and one thing your character is afraid of? This could be a person, it could be an event, it could be a memory. Get the players thinking. They can deliver that to you straight away. And now you should say to them in response, I may not use all of these things in the first session or even the first 10 sessions, but I now have them noted, which means they may come up. If ever you want to change them, just let me know. This conversation only needs to take about 5 minutes. And already you have ideas from the players of the story they want told, and maybe the players don't have ideas. Maybe the players say, well, I don't know, you're the storyteller, I'm just happy to be there. Some players will do that. Other players will come along and say, well, I'd really like an adventure where we're dealing with the Hecata because they're a clan I really like, or I want a Chronicle where we're trying to undermine the Tremere. I mean, everyone plays that Chronicle at some point or other. And so can we incorporate the Tremere? I'd like to be hunted. I'd like mortal hunters to be a big part of this Chronicle. Whatever the case may be, they give you some ideas. And what's more, you will have one player saying, my ambition is to strive for Golconda. I want to find some kind of inner peace in my humanity again. I want to discover it. My greatest fear is coming face to face with what's left of my mortal family because of the damage I did to them. I feel like if I'm confronted with that guilt, I'm going to descend on my humanity track. That is just a simple idea that could get thrown in. Immediately, you now have a list of ideas, or a web of ideas, if you like. And their characters aren't fully fleshed. They've not made their character sheets yet. But that's great. Now, you've got those building blocks, and you can build around it. These are the bones of the campaign, but you need to fill the meat section. Okay. So it's quite helpful to come up with a simple plot. And the great thing about horror is that most plots have already been done, and it is quite all right to do a plot that already exists, because you will find that through your players' actions, they will change things. So if there's a horror film you particularly like, so sticking with vampires for a moment, let's go to the good old classic of Dracula. The prince is worried. I don't usually go for the prince wants something. So in fact, let's not go for the prince. One of your primogen is worried. There is said to be an elder arriving in the city from far away. He is the ancestor of the prince who was destroyed by this primogen council years ago, decades ago. And now this Methuselah is sailing into the city to find out what has become of his descendant. This primogen says, you will all be owed a great boon if you can ensure that this Methuselah never makes it to shore. Now, you've got an action plot, you've got conspiracy, you could turn the tables on the primogen by getting the Methuselah on side. There is a story that's already there, and I came up with that like that. Admittedly, I've run an awful lot of vampire, but when we're talking about maximizing storytelling, all I had to do there was think of Dracula. Vampire on a boat arriving in a city. What would that do to shake up the status quo? Why would people be afraid of that? Why would some people welcome that? Immediately you can set up factions. People who are in favour, people who are afraid, people who are apathetic, people who may want to take advantage of the situation. But the great thing is, and again, this is a time-wasting thing, you don't need to assign every single NPC in the city an allegiance. Just think about the NPCs the characters have interacted with or will interact with, because those are the important ones. Anything else is just fan fiction, and that is not maximizing your time. The other element of maximizing time, because you've now got your plot, you now know what the players want, is think about those NPCs, the ones who are in orbit of your player characters. And I'm not talking about vampires here, I'm talking about mortals. Because our building blocks of a vampire game, we've got politics, we've got fear, and we have mortality. And the best way of reminding the vampires of their mortality, of their humanity, is surrounding them with humans. For probably about 10 years now, it took a while for it to change. My vampire games have far more mortal NPCs than they do vampire ones. Because I think if you surround them for far too long with vampires, they lose sight of the message of the game, which tends to be a struggle with humanity, and therefore you lose some of the horror. So come up with 1 or 2 mortal NPCs for each player character. If you're playing V5, that's great, because one of them is likely to be a touchstone. If not, that's also fine. Because you could have, and I often go to these, the landlord and the neighbour. Your vampire lives in a flat. One of these NPCs is always wanting the rent. The neighbour may be in an abusive relationship, compelling you to occasionally get involved. Just like that, you've maximised your time because you've got two characters, very easy to understand motivations. They will now cross paths with your vampire here and yon, occasionally interfering with the main plot. That is what these NPCs are for. You can have them in independent scenes, that's fantastic too. But imagine you have your vampire who is living in this grotty bedsit and is constantly having to use his dominate discipline to ensure that the landlord forgets that the rent hasn't been paid. But he then gets the call. The ship has just arrived at the dock. The box containing this Methuselah is going to be wheeled onto the shore. It's arrived early. You need to get to the docks now. So our Malkavian player character quickly dresses, bursts out of the door, at which point he hears a scream from the neighbour next door. And a scream. This neighbour, who is in an abusive relationship, is being abused right now. Does the Malkavian make the choice? Turn around and deal with the immediate personal problem, or go to the major political one? None of this takes time. I've explained all of this in about 16 minutes. Already we have a Chronicle. We've got the foundations of a Chronicle. It doesn't really matter what city we're in. It doesn't really matter what the politics are. It doesn't really matter, indeed, who the characters are. What we've done is explain how to use an existing plot, the existing vampire framework of politics, having normal, mortal concerns playing a part of it as well, to bring in different levels of horror. Because we've got tension from politics, we've got terror from mortal threat. I spoke about guilt, the guilt of being confronted with your humanity. That's something too. But let's talk about visceral horror now. Because it's always good to touch various horror beats. So unless your players have said, I really don't want to cover this, and basically put a line through certain options, let's say you get to the docks, and when you get there, it looks like the scene of a massacre. This then gives the storyteller the opportunity to describe in lurid detail the grotesqueries of disemboweled longshoremen and sailors and so on. It seems the Methuselah got out of the crate before we could get to them. Now where are they? So now not only do you have a crime scene to cover up, you've got this grotesqueness and you've got a hunt on your hands. Again, all of this in under 20 minutes. And the way we've got here is by talking about the things we don't want to do. We don't want to overplan it. We don't want to make this game really intricate where everything's got to fall into place like a Swiss watch. Rather, these are broad strokes. We've looked for political horror, we've looked for personal horror, we've looked for gore horror, and now we've got the tension of a hunt in the city as well. That is lots of elements of horror easily incorporated, and what's more, easily adjusted. Let's say the player characters aren't interested in the ship that's arriving and the Methuselah on it. Well, that Methuselah may well be interested in them. Let's say that they don't take part in this Primogen's offer because the players are feeling contrary. That happens, and while it's disappointing when it happens, let's say they blow him off and they focus on more personal things, and so they get back to setting up their nightclub. Well, maybe one night just before the dawn, there is a hammering on their door. The Methuselah is standing there dripping wet or dripping in blood. It's been raining and he's covered in blood. And he barrels in, says, "You will allow me to stay here overnight." Maybe doesn't use dominate. Maybe is so low on blood, can't do that. Is expecting a favour from you. Why? Why did the Methuselah come here? Because it turns out you are the Methuselah's descendant. You are the last surviving descendant of the prince that this Methuselah sired many, many years ago. And since your sire's destruction, you've had no connection to your bloodline. This Methuselah has been attracted to you as the last one standing. You make it personal, you bring it together again. And the storyteller shouldn't feel obliged to constantly bring the story back together, because the players may come up with something even better. But when we talk about maximizing time in horror preparation, it isn't about building a railroad that the players have got to follow down. It's coming up with those broad strokes. It's coming up with those strong ideas, scenes that players can play through that you might pull from popular fiction. The number of times I take scenes for my RPGs from, especially comics, I find. If you're familiar with the works of Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, the Criminal graphic novels, Fatale, Reckless, they are all like little noir stories. And the great thing about noir is there's a mystery, there tends to be a twist, a betrayal, and death. And you can easily amp up the horror there, or the mystery of it, and that makes it perfect for a horror game, whether you're running vampire, werewolf, Promethean, mage, whatever. Anyway, there isn't a simple formula, but if you do what I'm suggesting in this video, you should be able to come up with a Chronicle pretty easily. And I hope that this video has proven helpful to you, Matthew, and anyone else watching. If any of you have any questions and you want to see videos by me on those subjects, then please definitely pick up a hard copy of The World Below, or, even better, pick up a hard copy of Monster Kingdoms. Monster Kingdoms is crowdfunding right now, and we are at 200% of our funding target, thereabouts, which means we are stomping through stretch goals, which is fantastic. And as I have described it before, and I will continue to describe it, Monster Kingdoms is playing a Sabbat group, a Sabbat pack in a fantasy game. You are playing the monsters, you are evil, the world is evil, evil won, you are Sabbat in a fantasy world, go. And it seems to be pleasing an awful lot of people. So if that appeals to you, click on the Monster Kingdoms link below. I would love your support. And if you order a hard copy, contact me through MatthewDawkins.com and request a video. Thank you very much for watching. Be seeing you.